Barbaric laughter echoed through the deep forest as volley after volley of paintballs slammed into the trembling body of a small puppy. To this group of entitled rich kids, the innocent creature's agony was just a sick game, a cruel secret they believed the woods would hide forever. But they made a fatal mistake. They didn't realize that deep in the shadows, the steel-cold eyes of a retired Navy SEAL were watching their every move. A real hunt is about to begin, but this time, the hunters will become the prey. This isn't just a story of justice served cold. It is a powerful, tear-jerking journey of healing, love, and redemption. Don't look away. Please hit subscribe now to help us spread the miracle of compassion and ensure you never miss a story that touches the soul. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines of the Blackwood Ridge, shrouding the world in a heavy, wet silence that smelled of damp earth and decaying pine needles, a cold and indifferent sanctuary that offered the only peace Evan could tolerate. At 38 years old, Evan was a man carved from the rugged, unyielding material of the mountains themselves, moving through the dense undergrowth with a predatory grace that belied his size. Standing 6'2" with broad, powerful shoulders that had once carried the weight of fallen brothers across foreign deserts, he was a figure of imposing physical discipline, yet his posture carried a subtle, constant tension, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. His face, exposed to the biting morning air, was clean-shaven, revealing a strong, square jawline that seemed permanently set in a clench of suppressed vigilance. There were no jagged scars marring his skin, but the toll of his service was written in the deep, prematurely etched lines around his eyes and the weathered, sun-beaten texture of his complexion. His eyes were the most arresting feature, steel gray, piercing, and constantly scanning the perimeter, possessing a 1,000-yard stare that looked through the trees rather than at them, seeing threats that had long since faded from reality but remained vivid in his mind. He kept his dark hair cropped short, a lingering habit from his days as a Navy SEAL, and wore a faded camouflage jacket that blended perfectly with the foliage, a ghost haunting his own life. Evan was a man who had seen too much of the darkness in human nature, leading him to retreat to this cabin at the edge of civilization, where the silence was loud enough to drown out the ringing in his ears. He was not alone in this self-imposed exile. Beside him trotted Bear, a massive German shepherd who was as much a part of Evan's soul as his own heartbeat. Bear was 10 years old, a retired military working dog with a coat that mixed the colors of burnt toast and midnight, now dusted with the snowy white of age around his muzzle. The dog moved with a slight rhythmic limp in his rear right leg, a mirror to the stiffness in Evan's own gait, both of them veterans carrying the invisible and visible wounds of the same wars. Bear was not a pet. He was a partner, his intelligence shining through amber eyes that possessed a human-like depth of understanding. He stopped when Evan stopped, breathed when Evan breathed, and they communicated in a language of subtle hand signals and shared glances that required no words. Today, their mission was simple and grounded, tracking a wild beehive Evan had noted weeks ago near the creek, seeking the raw sweetness of honey to store for the coming winter. The rhythm of their hike was meditative, the crunch of boots and paws on dry leaves the only sound breaking the stillness until the forest's natural palette was violently interrupted. It started with a flash of color that had no business existing in nature, a splatter of neon pink smeared aggressively across the rough bark of a Douglas fir. Evan froze instantly, his hand instinctively drifting to the knife at his belt, not out of malice, but muscle memory honed by years of survival. He crouched, his brow furrowing as he touched the substance. It was wet, sticky, and chemically pungent. Paint. He looked further up the trail and saw more. Vibrant electric blue splattered on ferns, bright yellow dripping from a stone like toxic sludge. It looked like a massacre of clowns, a chaotic and disrespectful defacement of the pristine woods that made Evan's stomach churn. Bear, who had been sniffing a patch of moss, suddenly went rigid. The hair along the dog's spine stood up in a jagged ridge, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest, a sound Evan hadn't heard since their days on patrol in active war zones. This wasn't a reaction to a squirrel or a deer. This was the specific, high-alert signal for something wrong, something suffering or dangerous. "Easy, brother," Evan whispered, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in the sudden tension. He followed Bear's gaze, which was fixed intensely on a dense thicket of brambles about 20 yards off the main game trail. The silence of the woods suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with a hidden tragedy that hung in the air like smoke. As they moved closer, the chaotic splashes of paint became more concentrated, leading like a breadcrumb trail of cruelty toward the bushes. Evan pushed aside the thorny branches, ignoring the way they snagged on his jacket, and what he saw made the breath hitch in his throat, igniting a cold, white-hot fury in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Huddled deep in the shadows, pressed into the dirt as if trying to disappear from the world entirely, was a puppy. It was a German shepherd, perhaps only 3 or 4 months old, a miniature echo of Bear, but it was unrecognizable. The creature's fur was matted and caked with layers of hardened paint, red, green, blue, and orange, forming a stiff shell that seemingly imprisoned its small body. The puppy was shaking so violently that the leaves around it trembled, its eyes wide orbs of absolute terror, white-rimmed and darting frantically. It didn't look like an animal anymore. It looked like a target, a discarded prop from a sick game. Bear whined softly, a sound of pure empathy, and lowered his head, inching forward to sniff the trembling creature. The puppy flinched, letting out a sharp, high-pitched yelp that cracked Evan's heart wide open. In that moment, the solitude Evan cherished vanished, replaced by a singular, overwhelming drive. The mission had changed. He wasn't a hermit anymore. He was a protector, and he was looking at a casualty of a war he hadn't known was being fought in his own backyard. The fragile silence of the forest was shattered not by nature, but by the mechanical roar of a modified Jeep engine tearing through the underbrush, followed by the raucous, disjointed rhythm of human shouting. Evan remained crouched over the trembling puppy, his hand hovering protectively above the matted fur, his body instantly transitioning from a state of mourning to a state of combat readiness. The sound of tires crushing saplings grew louder, accompanied by the distinct sharp thwip pop of paintball markers being test-fired into the trees. They were coming back. Evan's eyes, cold and calculating, shifted to Bear, who had lowered his body flat against the earth, his ears pinned back, a low, silent vibration of a growl rippling through his ribcage. Through the gaps in the ferns, the intruders came into view, a chaotic stain on the green canvas of the woods. Leading the pack was a young man who looked to be about 20 years old, striding with an arrogance that suggested he had never been told no in his entire life. This was Brody, the ringleader, a tall and lanky figure with slicked-back blonde hair that remained irritatingly perfect despite the rugged terrain. He was dressed in high-end, brand-new tactical gear that he wore like a costume rather than a uniform. A black, tactical vest laden with unnecessary pouches, pristine combat boots that had never seen mud before today, and expensive polarized aviator sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead. His face was sharp, almost handsome in a conventional way, but marred by a mouth that curled into a perpetual, sneering smirk and eyes that held a glint of detached cruelty, the look of someone who crushed ants just to watch them stop moving. Behind Brody trailed 3 others, a mixed group of sycophants echoing his laughter, their movements clumsy and loud, snapping twigs and stomping through the brush with zero awareness of their surroundings. They carried high-end paintball markers that were modified to look like military-grade assault rifles, treating the forest not as a living ecosystem, but as a backdrop for their violent amusement. "Where did the little rat go?" Brody shouted, his voice cracking with impatient excitement as he fired a burst of bright yellow paint at a squirrel that scrambled up a nearby oak. "It couldn't have gone far. It can barely walk." The group erupted in laughter, a jarring, ugly sound that made the puppy in front of Evan whimper. The noise was a death sentence in Evan's world, but here it was their shield of ignorance. Evan knew that confronting 4 armed individuals, even if armed only with high-velocity paintballs, while holding a compromised animal, was a tactical error. The paintballs could blind or cause serious injury to the already fragile puppy, and Bear, protective as he was, might maul one of them, leading to legal catastrophes that would expose Evan's secluded life. The mission was extraction, not engagement. With the fluid, silent precision of a ghost, Evan scooped the puppy into his arms. The animal was stiff with terror, its heart hammering against Evan's chest like a trapped bird, but the warmth of the man's body seemed to shock it into a frozen silence. Evan signaled Bear with a single, sharp hand gesture. Silent. Heel. The old dog understood instantly, falling in behind Evan's left leg, moving with a synchronized stealth that made them invisible to the untrained eye. Evan utilized the terrain with masterful ease, slipping into the deeper shadows of a ravine just as Brody and his crew stomped into the clearing where the puppy had been lying moments before. "Check the bushes," Brody commanded, kicking at the ferns with his heavy boot. Evan watched them from 20 yards away, concealed behind the massive, moss-covered trunk of a fallen cedar. He observed their lack of discipline. They grouped together, their barrels pointing dangerously at one another, their eyes focused on the ground rather than the perimeter. They were tourists playing war, children with dangerous toys, unaware that a true predator was watching them from the darkness. The smell of CO2 gas and cheap cologne drifted on the breeze, sickeningly artificial against the scent of pine. One of Brody's friends, a heavyset boy struggling with the weight of his gear, paused near Evan's hiding spot to catch his breath, scanning the woods with bored eyes. Evan didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He simply existed as a part of the wood, his heartbeat controlled, his presence masked. The boy turned away, shouting, "It's gone, Brody. Probably crawled into a hole to die." Brody cursed, firing a final angry volley of red paint into the brush, the capsules exploding inches from where Evan's boot was planted. "Fine," Brody spat, adjusting his vest. "We'll find another one next week. Let's get back to the lodge." As the group turned and began their noisy retreat back to their vehicle, Evan waited a full 5 minutes, ensuring the threat had truly dissipated. Only then did he move. He shifted the puppy, whose sticky, paint-covered fur clung to his jacket, and began the trek back to his cabin. The path home was taken with urgency now, every step calculated to put distance between the innocent life in his arms and the monsters who had treated it as sport. They reached the edge of the clearing where Evan's cabin stood, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs and stone that promised safety. As he stepped onto the porch, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold resolve. He had won the skirmish by avoiding it, but as he looked down at the traumatized creature in his arms, Evan knew the war was far from over. The heavy oak door of the cabin clicked shut, the metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding into place acting as a final severance from the chaotic violence of the outside world. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried sage, a sharp contrast to the damp, chemical-tainted atmosphere of the forest floor. Evan moved with a deliberate, quiet urgency, carrying the rigid bundle of the puppy into the kitchen, where the morning light filtered softly through dust motes dancing in the air. He laid the animal gently on the sturdy pine table, which he had quickly lined with thick, clean towels. The puppy, a small, trembling heap of misery, did not attempt to run. The hardened paint had turned its coat into a straitjacket, restricting movement and pulling painfully at the skin with every breath. Bear, the old German shepherd, paced around the table, his claws clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor, letting out low, mournful whines that vibrated in his throat. He nudged Evan's elbow with a wet nose, his amber eyes filled with a desperate plea to fix the broken thing before them. Evan rested a hand briefly on Bear's head, a silent promise between soldiers before turning to the task at hand. He retrieved a basin of warm water, a bottle of olive oil from the pantry, and a stack of soft cloths. This was not a battlefield, but the preparation felt eerily similar to setting up a field triage station. The focus, the suppression of emotion, the absolute necessity of precision. Evan began the process by pouring a generous amount of oil into his palms, rubbing them together to warm the liquid before touching the animal. When his hands made contact with the puppy's flank, the creature let out a sharp, high-pitched scream, flinching so violently it nearly slid off the table. The sound was raw, a piercing arrow of pure trauma that echoed off the log walls. "Easy, little one. I know it hurts," Evan murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly, soothing rumble. He didn't pull back. Instead, he maintained a steady, firm pressure, letting the oil soak into the matted clumps of blue and red paint. As he worked his thumbs into the fur, breaking down the chemical bonds of the dried latex, the tactile sensation triggered a flash of memory so vivid it nearly stopped his hands. Suddenly, he wasn't in a cabin in Oregon. He was in the back of a dusty Humvee in Fallujah, his hands slick not with oil but with blood, trying to pack a wound on a rookie teammate while the world exploded outside. The smell of the paint, sharp and artificial, twisted in his mind into the smell of cordite and antiseptic. The puppy's trembling body under his fingers felt just like the shock-ridden tremors of a man realizing he might not go home. Evan blinked hard, forcing the ghost of the desert away, grounding himself back in the scent of pine and olive oil. He wasn't saving a soldier today, but the weight of the life in his hands felt exactly the same. The cleaning process was a slow, agonizing excruciation for both man and beast. As the paint began to dissolve and slide away, the water in the basin turned a murky, toxic sludge of gray and brown. Underneath the vibrant, mocking colors of the paintball game, the reality of the abuse was revealed. The puppy's skin was hot to the touch, littered with welts and angry purple bruises where the high-velocity rounds had struck muscle and bone. There were patches of raw, red irritation where the chemicals had burned the skin. Throughout it all, Bear refused to leave his post. He stood on his hind legs, resting his front paws gently on the edge of the table, bringing his face level with the puppy. Whenever the puppy whimpered or thrashed in panic, Bear would lean in and lick the small creature's face, long, slow, rhythmic strokes of his rough tongue. It was a primal, paternal language of comfort that Evan could never replicate. The puppy, initially terrified of the large dog, began to lean into Bear's touch, finding an anchor in the older dog's steady presence. Bear's deep, rhythmic breathing seemed to act as a metronome, guiding the puppy's frantic heart rate down to a manageable tempo. After nearly an hour, the last of the paint was rinsed away. Evan wrapped the wet, shivering animal in a dry, fluffy towel, rubbing him vigorously to generate heat. The dog that emerged from the colorful shell was thin, his ribs showing through the wet fur. But he was undeniably beautiful. A black and tan German shepherd with oversized paws and ears that were slightly too big for his head. He looked up at Evan, his dark eyes exhausted but no longer wild with blind panic. There was a spark of recognition there, a tentative acceptance of safety. "You're a fighter," Evan said softly, lifting the bundled puppy and carrying him to the rug in front of the fireplace. "You survived the mission. That makes you a ranger." The name felt right, solid, military, a title earned through endurance. He set Ranger down next to Bear, who immediately curled his massive body around the puppy, creating a living wall of fur and heat. Ranger hesitated for only a second before crawling into the curve of Bear's belly, letting out a long, shuddering sigh as he closed his heavy eyelids. Evan sat back in his armchair, watching the firelight dance across the two sleeping forms, the old warrior and the new recruit. The rage at the boys in the woods was still there, burning cold in his gut. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the pain had been washed away, leaving only the beginning of healing. With Ranger finally sleeping the deep, twitching sleep of the exhausted, Evan took the opportunity to conduct a more thorough medical assessment, his hands moving with the gentle precision of a field medic checking for hidden shrapnel. As he ran his fingers along the puppy's neck, checking for swollen lymph nodes, his calloused thumb snagged on something buried deep within the thick ruff of fur that had escaped the worst of the paint. It was a collar, so thin and cheap it was almost threadbare, a fraying strip of red nylon that had been tightened to the point of cruelty nearly embedded in the growing dog's skin. There was no name tag, no jingling metal bone, just a small plastic rivets tag stamped with a QR code and the faded acronym SHS, ID 8904. The generic nature of it made Evan's stomach churn. It was an inventory tag, not a possession of love. It belonged to the Somerton Humane Society, a facility in the valley town 20 miles south. Leaving Bear on guard duty, a command the old dog accepted with a solemn nod, positioning himself between the sleeping puppy and the door, Evan grabbed his keys. He needed intel, and he needed it before the sun went down. The drive down the winding mountain switchbacks was done in silence, the hum of his battered 1998 Ford F-150 the only noise accompanying his darkening thoughts. The truck, much like its owner, was rugged, utilitarian, and scarred by years of hard use, its faded matte black paint peeling in spots to reveal the primer beneath. Evan drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road but his mind replaying the sound of the boys' laughter in the woods. The Somerton Humane Society was a squat, cinder-block building on the edge of town, smelling faintly of bleach and wet fur. Evan stepped inside, his imposing frame instantly shrinking the small, cluttered waiting room. The air conditioning hummed loudly, battling the afternoon heat. Behind the front desk sat a woman who looked like she carried the weight of every abandoned animal in the county on her shoulders. This was Sarah Miller, the shelter manager. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with a chaotic halo of frizzy, graying brown hair pulled back into a messy bun held together by a pencil. Her face was kind but etched with deep lines of perpetual exhaustion, her skin pale and devoid of makeup, revealing the dark circles under hazel eyes that had seen too much neglect. She wore blue medical scrubs covered in tiny, erratic paw prints and stray dog hairs, a uniform of service that commanded Evan's immediate respect. When Evan placed the cut collar on the counter, Sarah's expression shifted from polite customer service to a look of haunted recognition. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the plastic tag, her fingers tracing the number 8904. "This is Barnaby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was adopted 3 days ago. A German Shepherd mix. High anxiety. We thought he finally found a good home." Evan leaned forward, his voice low, devoid of aggression but heavy with an intensity that demanded the truth. "He didn't find a home. I found him in the woods, painted like a target, starving and terrified. Who took him, Sarah?" The woman looked around the empty waiting room, then lowered her voice, leaning over the counter as if fearing the walls were listening. She typed quickly on her computer, turning the screen slightly so Evan could see. "It's a group of young men," she explained, bitterness seeping into her tone. "They come in every few weeks. Different names on the paperwork, John Doe, Mike Smith, but it's the same address or the same credit card. They specifically ask for the hard cases. The dogs that are scared, the ones that have been here too long, the ones nobody else wants. They present themselves as rehabilitation experts, rich kids with big backyards." Sarah pointed to a photo on the screen. It was a scanned copy of a driver's license used for the adoption. The name was fake, but the face was unmistakable. Brody. The same sneering arrogance Evan had seen through the trees. "We can't prove anything," Sarah admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "We suspected, but they are the sons of the town council, the developers, the people who fund this shelter. If we accuse them without proof, they shut us down. But the dogs, they never come back for checkups. They just vanish." The revelation hit Evan like a physical blow. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty by bored teenagers. It was a systemic, organized culling of the vulnerable. They were using the shelter as a hunting reserve, preying on creatures that society had already discarded, knowing that no one would look for a problem dog that ran away. It was a perversion of the very instinct to protect that defined Evan's life. He looked at the file, at the list of dogs adopted over the last 6 months. A 3-legged pit bull, a blind beagle, an anxious collie. All gone. All likely hunted down in his woods. The anger that had been a hot coal in his chest solidified into something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the icy clarity of a mission objective locking into place. Evan took a picture of the screen with his phone, his hand steady. "You don't have to accuse them, Sarah," Evan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down the woman's spine. "You just focus on saving the ones inside. I'll handle the ones who got out." He turned and walked out of the clinic, the bell on the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the darkness that had just descended upon him. As he climbed back into his truck, Evan wasn't just a retired soldier anymore. He was a man preparing for a counterinsurgency. They wanted to play war in the woods. They wanted to hunt things that couldn't fight back. Evan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He would show them what happens when the prey has teeth. He would not just save Ranger. He would dismantle their entire operation, not with the law, which they owned, but with the fear they so enjoyed inflicting on others. The sun had barely dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the Blackwood Ridge, casting long, bruising shadows across the forest floor, when the intrusion began. It wasn't the subtle snap of a twig that alerted Evan, but the aggressive, mechanical growl of the modified Jeep engine clawing its way up the fire road, a sound that violated the twilight silence. Evan stood on the porch of his cabin, a mug of black coffee in his hand, his posture relaxed but his eyes narrowing into slits of cold calculation. He had expected this. The tire tracks he had left near the drop site were distinct, and men like Brody, arrogant, entitled, and used to owning the world, didn't take theft lightly. They weren't coming for the dog. They were coming to punish the man who had dared to interrupt their game. Inside the cabin, Bear let out a low, warning woof. Evan stepped back inside, his movements precise and calm. "Watch," he commanded softly, pointing to the rug where Ranger was curled up, still recovering. He didn't reach for the shotgun locked in the cabinet. Lethal force was a failure of imagination, and today, Evan wasn't a soldier killing enemies. He was a phantom haunting a playground. He grabbed a different kit, a high-definition handheld camcorder, a bag of heavy-duty zip ties, several smoke canisters left over from training exercises, and a spool of high-tensile fishing line. He slipped out the back door and melted into the tree line just as the Jeep's headlights swept across the front of the cabin, illuminating the logs in a harsh, blinding glare. Brody and his 3 cronies spilled out of the vehicle, their laughter replaced by a drunk, angry bravado. They were dressed for a raid, wearing their expensive tactical cosplay, their paintball markers raised like assault rifles. "Come out, old man," Brody screamed, his voice cracking slightly. "We know you took the mutt. Give it back and maybe we won't paint your house pink." One of his friends, a stocky boy named Tyler who looked nervous, fired a round at the cabin window. The paintball exploded against the shutter with a loud thwack, leaving a dripping blue stain. From the darkness of the pines, Evan watched through the viewfinder of his camcorder, the red rec light blinking silently. He filmed the license plate, the weapons, the aggressive posturing, and the property damage. Evidence secured. Now the lesson began. Evan moved to the north perimeter, where he had prepared the ground earlier that afternoon. He pulled a taut line connected to a simple tension-release mechanism rigged to a suspended log. As Brody signaled his friends to advance toward the porch, the woods to their left suddenly erupted with a terrifying, rhythmic clack, 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 the sound of wood striking wood, mimicking the racking of a heavy slide. The boys froze, their heads whipping toward the noise. "What was that?" Tyler whispered, backing up. Before Brody could answer, Evan pulled the second line. A smoke canister hidden in a hollow stump 10 yards to their right hissed violently, spewing a thick white cloud of chemical fog that rolled over the clearing in seconds, swallowing the Jeep and the boys in a disorienting haze. "He's got a gun! He's crazy!" one of the other boys shouted, panic rising in his voice. Evan moved through the smoke like a shark in murky water, silent and unseen. He flanked them, positioning himself behind a thick oak tree. He clicked on his heavy-duty tactical flashlight, set to a disorienting high-speed strobe, and cast the beam directly into their faces. The blinding, pulsing light shattered their depth perception, turning the smoke into a flashing nightmare wall. They couldn't see him. They could only see the strobe hitting the fog, making it impossible to tell where the threat was coming from. "Drop the markers," a voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere. Evan projected his voice deep from his diaphragm, a command tone honed on battlefields to cut through chaos. It wasn't a request. The psychological effect was instant. These were bullies playing at war, but they had just encountered a warlord. Tyler dropped his expensive paintball gun instantly, shielding his eyes. "Brody, let's go! Let's just go!" he screamed. Brody, trying to salvage his ego, fired blindly into the smoke, the paintballs whizzing harmlessly into the trees. Evan didn't flinch. He simply threw a small, weighted object, a rock wrapped in a rag, into the brush behind them, creating a heavy, crunching sound that suggested a massive predator lunging. It was the breaking point. The illusion of control shattered. "Run!" Brody shrieked, his bravado dissolving into pure, primal terror. The group scrambled over each other to get back to the Jeep, slipping in the mud, dropping gear, and hyperventilating. The engine roared to life, gears grinding as Brody threw the car into reverse, spinning tires on the gravel before tearing back down the fire road, fleeing a ghost they never even saw. Evan stood in the dissipating smoke. The tactical light clicked off, the forest returning to silence. He checked the camera. The footage was perfect. He hadn't fired a shot, hadn't touched them, but he had planted a seed of fear that would grow every time they looked at these woods. He walked back to the cabin, wiped the blue paint off the shutter, and went inside to feed the dogs. The perimeter was secure. The transition from a battlefield to a sanctuary was never immediate. A truth Evan knew in his marrow, and it was a reality now dictating the rhythm of life within the cabin. 2 days after the incident in the woods, the legal machinery had finally begun to turn. Sheriff Boyd, a man in his late 50s with a stomach that strained against his beige uniform and a face worn smooth by years of small-town diplomacy, had come to collect the footage. Boyd was a man of few words, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a Stetson, but his handshake was firm, and the grim set of his mouth as he watched the video of Brody's crew terrorizing the woods told Evan that the boys' days of impunity were over. With the external threat neutralized, restraining orders issued, and a criminal investigation launched, the silence returned to the ridge. However, for Ranger, the war was still echoing loudly within the confines of his own mind. The puppy was physically healing. The welts were fading into dull shadows under his growing coat, and his ribs no longer jutted out like the hull of a wrecked ship. Yet the psychological shrapnel remained embedded deep. The cabin, meant to be a haven, was a minefield of triggers for the traumatized animal. A dropped spoon in the kitchen would send a ranger scrambling under the sofa, his bladder releasing in uncontrollable fear. The sight of a broom, a long, rigid object resembling a rifle barrel, caused him to flatten himself against the floor, whining with a pitch that broke Evan's heart. Evan approached the rehabilitation of Ranger with the same calculated, relentless patience he had once applied to dismantling explosives. There was no room for frustration, only the repetitive, soothing cadence of safety. The training ground was the meadow behind the cabin, a wide expanse of wildflowers and tall grass bordered by the creek. This was where the hierarchy of the new pack was established. Bear took the lead, assuming the role of the senior instructor with a stoic grace that Evan admired. The old German shepherd seemed to understand that Ranger didn't know how to be a dog. He only knew how to be a victim. Bear would nudge Ranger with his nose, encouraging him to sniff a deer trail, to mark a tree, to engage with the world rather than hide from it. When Ranger hesitated, freezing at the sound of a snapping twig, Bear would simply stand between the puppy and the noise, a living shield communicating a silent message. I have the watch. You are safe. Evan observed from a distance, using a long training lead, offering low words of praise, letting the bond between the two dogs do the heavy lifting. He realized he was witnessing a transfer of wisdom, the old soldier teaching the young recruit that vigilance didn't have to mean paranoia. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky of piercing, cloudless blue. Evan had brought out a simple yellow tennis ball, an object of joy for most dogs, but an object of suspicion for Ranger. For weeks, Ranger had watched Bear chase the ball, his eyes wide, body tense, unable to bridge the gap between desire and fear. The motion of Evan's arm raising to throw the ball was too similar to a strike, too similar to a weapon being raised. Every time Evan lifted his arm, Ranger flinched. Today, however, Evan changed the tactic. He sat on the grass, reducing his towering height, making himself small and non-threatening. He didn't throw the ball, he rolled it gently across the turf. Go on, Ranger, he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Bear trotted after the ball but didn't pick it up. Instead, the massive dog nudged it back toward the puppy, stepping aside to leave the prize open. It was an invitation. Ranger looked at the ball, then at Evan, and finally at Bear. The internal struggle was visible in the twitch of his ears and the shifting of his weight. Then something shifted. Perhaps it was the smell of the grass, the encouragement in Bear's posture, or simply the exhaustion of being afraid for so long. Ranger took a step, then another. His movements were jerky at first, expecting a reprimand that never came. When his nose touched the fuzzy yellow surface, nothing exploded. No pain followed. He nudged it. The ball rolled. A spark lit up in his dark eyes, a flicker of the playful spirit that had been beaten down but not extinguished. Suddenly, Ranger didn't just nudge it, he pounced. It was a clumsy, puppy-like motion, paws splayed, ears flopping. He grabbed the ball in his mouth and looked at Evan, tail giving a tentative, low wag. Evan smiled, a genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. Good boy, he said, and this time he stood up slowly and tossed a second ball, underhand and gentle. Ranger didn't flinch. He turned and ran, his legs pumping, ears streaming back in the wind, chasing the arc of the ball not to escape, but to capture. Bear barked, a deep, joyous sound, and ran alongside him. For the first time, Ranger wasn't running from death, he was running toward life. Evan watched the two of them, the scarred veteran and the healing survivor, tearing through the tall grass and felt a knot in his own chest loosen. The perimeter was secure, the enemy was gone, and the pack was finally whole. The seasons turned with the slow, inevitable grind of the mountain, the vibrant greens of late summer fading into the burning golds of autumn, and finally settling into the crisp, biting whites of early winter. The Blackwood Ridge was transformed under a blanket of snow, a pristine silence that felt clean rather than empty. 6 months had passed since the day the forest was stained with neon paint, and the creature that bounded through the snowdrifts now bore little resemblance to the trembling, broken thing Evan had carried home in his jacket. Ranger was no longer a puppy. At 10 months old, he was a striking adolescent German shepherd, his frame filling out with lean, powerful muscle that rippled beneath a coat of glossy black and rich tan. His ears, once too large for his head, now stood sharp and alert, swiveling like radar dishes to catch the snap of a frozen branch or the distant call of a crow. He moved with a loping, confident gait, his paws kicking up sprays of powder as he patrolled the perimeter of the clearing, not out of fear, but out of a newfound sense of duty. He was the guardian of the cabin now, a role he shared with Bear, though the older dog was content to watch from the porch, his muzzle resting on his paws, his amber eyes following the younger dog's antics with the weary pride of a retired general watching a cadet graduate. The resolution to the violence of the past summer had arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, final stroke of a judge's pen. Sheriff Boyd had stopped by the cabin a week prior, his patrol car navigating the icy fire road with surprising grace. He handed Evan a thick envelope containing the court's final judgment. Brody and his cohorts, stripped of their arrogance and their expensive toys, had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of animal cruelty and malicious destruction of property. The influence of their wealthy fathers had crumbled under the weight of the undeniable video evidence Evan had captured, the smoke, the terror, the reckless hate. The sentence was severe and fitting. Heavy fines that would bleed their trust funds dry, hundreds of hours of community service at the very shelter they had exploited, and, most satisfying of all, a lifetime ban on owning or caring for any animal. They were marked now, not with paint, but with a record that would follow them longer than any game. As Evan watched the smoke rise from his chimney, he felt the cold knot of anger that had lived in his gut for months finally dissolve. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that the sanctuary of the woods remained violated no more. The war was over. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange, Evan stepped out onto the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand. He was dressed in a heavy wool coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The tension that had defined his posture for years, the rigid shoulders, the clenched jaw, the constant scanning for threats, had softened. He sat in the rough-hewn rocking chair, the wood creaking a familiar rhythm. Bear immediately shifted, leaning his heavy weight against Evan's leg, a solid anchor of warmth. Ranger, seeing his pack settle, abandoned his patrol of the snowdrifts and trotted up the steps. He shook himself vigorously, sending a cloud of snow flying, before collapsing with a contented groan on the other side of Evan's chair. The young dog rested his head on Evan's boot, looking up with eyes that were clear, bright, and utterly devoid of the shadows that had once haunted them. In this quiet moment, surrounded by the breathing of the two animals, Evan realized the profound shift that had occurred within himself. For years, he had worn his isolation like armor, believing that solitude was the only way to manage the noise in his head, the only way to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. He had thought he was rescuing Ranger, pulling a helpless victim from the brush to give it a second chance. But as he looked at the strong, vibrant animal at his feet and the loyal, aging companion at his side, the truth hit him with the force of a revelation. Ranger hadn't just needed saving, he had needed a leader, a purpose, a pack. And in providing that, Evan had been forced to step out of his own darkness. He had to be calm to soothe the puppy's fear. He had to be present to teach the lessons of trust. He had to be alive to protect them. The silence of the cabin was no longer the silence of a man hiding from the world. It was the peaceful silence of a family resting after a long day. The ringing in his ears seemed to fade, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of Ranger's tail against the floorboards. They were a motley crew, a scarred soldier, a retired war dog, and a survivor of cruelty. But together, they were whole. Evan reached down, burying one hand in Bear's thick ruff and the other in Ranger's soft fur. The sun slipped behind the mountain, and for the first time in a long time, Evan didn't fear the coming night. He wasn't alone in the dark anymore. Evan and Ranger's journey reminds us that true miracles are not always thunderous events, but quiet moments of grace orchestrated by God. It was no accident that a broken man found a broken dog in those woods. It was a divine appointment that healed them both. This story is a testament that God often uses the unlikeliest of paths to lead us home, proving that love is the ultimate instrument of restoration. We all carry scars, but as we saw today, no one is ever truly forsaken or beyond the reach of a helping hand. We hope this narrative has filled your spirit with peace and reminded you of the power of compassion in your daily life. Please consider subscribing to our channel, sharing this video with friends who need a light in the dark, and leaving a comment below about the animals that have healed your heart. May God bless you. watch over your families, and keep you safe until we meet again.